Good morning, everyone. This is Zheng Xin from New York. Sitting next to me is Dr. Bernanke. We are honored to have you here. Dr. Bernanke has been chairman of the Federal Reserve from 2006 to 2014. From 2005 to 2006, he's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under the Bush administration. From 2002 to 2005, he's a governor of the Federal Reserve. Before that, he's the director of the economics department at Princeton University and a professor at the Stanford University Graduate School of Business. So the first part of our agenda is Dr. Bernanke's keynote speech for about 30 minutes on the global economic outlook. So with that, please go ahead, Dr. Bernanke.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to Kaishin for inviting me. I'm sorry I can't be in China. I'm happy to be here in New York City speaking to you. I've been asked to talk about the global economic outlook, and I will cover some of the major regions of the world. And I'll start with the United States, which, of course, is the country I know best, and with China, I think, are the two major countries driving the global economy. It's good to look back a few years. The very severe recession drove the unemployment rate in 2009 up to 10%, which is the highest, matched the highest that we've seen since World War II. But since 2009, we're now in the 8th year of expansion in the United States. Job creation has been quite steady. The economy's continued to grow. And so there's been a very substantial improvement and recovery from the very deep recession that followed the financial crisis. So that's the good news. In addition, I think that there's plenty of evidence that the recovery ongoing in the United States can continue. One of the main factors driving the U.S. economic recovery is households, is consumers. And consumer financial condition has been improving. It is right now quite solid. Consumers have paid off their debts, so their obligations to pay interest on mortgages, on credit cards, and the like has gone down quite substantially. Jobs have come back so that people are working, they're receiving income, their wages have been rising. House prices have, after collapsing in the crisis, have begun to rise again, and in fact have just recently reached the pre-crisis peak. Stock prices have risen, again reaching highs that we haven't seen before. So all around, the financial condition of American households is a lot stronger. They're feeling a lot better. The consumer confidence numbers are higher. They're happy to pay low prices for gasoline at the gasoline pump. And so consumer spending, both on U.S. goods and on imports, looks to be pretty solid. And that, as I'm sure you know, the consumer, the households, are a very big part of the U.S. economy. And with their good condition, we expect to see that source of strength continue. And we'll look to see the U.S. economy continue to expand. Now, related to that is the housing sector itself. Of course, residential housing collapsed, figuratively speaking anyway, after the crisis. There was a bubble. House prices went very high. They fell. Construction fell very low. And it took some time to recover. But the housing sector has improved considerably, again, with the financial conditions of households. And it is also a source of expansion in the U.S. economy. Now, not everything is positive. The very strong dollar has made it more difficult for U.S. manufacturing companies to compete internationally, and that has been a relatively weak sector. Capital investment has not been as strong as we would like. But generally speaking, again, the U.S. economy does seem to be moving forward. And in particular, inflation has been low. And in the past, historically, high inflation has led the Fed to raise interest rates very quickly and has sometimes been the source of new downturns, new recessions. That doesn't seem to be a problem right now. So overall, again, a lot of progress has been made, come a long way from the depths of the Great Recession, 8th year of recovery, and it looks that there is still some room to run, some ability of the U.S. economy to continue to grow and to create jobs. And we'll learn more tomorrow morning. We'll be seeing new job numbers for the month of November coming out here in the United States. Now, the Federal Reserve, which is the organization that I was the head of for 8 years, of course, is watching all this very carefully, trying to decide what to do about interest rates, what to do about monetary policy. There's been a very good debate going on at the Fed. The Fed is very close now to its goals. The inflation rate is approaching the 2% target that the Fed has set. The unemployment rate now close to 5%, which is more or less full employment. So the Fed is close to its goals and trying to decide how to proceed from here. The debate has been, to some extent, about whether the Fed should allow the economy to overshoot, to go beyond the objectives of the Fed, to let inflation rise a bit above 2%, for example, or to let unemployment fall a bit below 5%, the natural rate of unemployment. And the arguments for doing that are several. I mean, one is that it's been a very long and painful period of recovery, and by allowing the labor market to get a little bit hot, it could be the case that more people will come back into the labor force, people who have dropped out because they thought there were no good job opportunities. If the economy runs a little bit hot, so the argument goes, then some of those people might come back in and be working again. Likewise, with inflation having been below the 2% target for so long, some argue that by allowing inflation to go a bit above 2%, that will reestablish the credibility of the Fed's 2% target and give more confidence to the public that the Fed does intend to keep inflation close to 2%. The final argument for those who want to be very, very cautious about raising interest rates is that rates are still very close to zero. And if the Fed were to find itself in a situation where the economy was slowing down for some reason, it would be hard to cut rates, obviously, because interest rates are very close to zero. And so for that reason, they argue, you might want to be cautious about raising interest rates too prematurely. So there is an argument for being very cautious. On the other hand, there are folks who say, well, look, we are already at our goals. Interest rates are very low. We don't want to let inflation get out of control. If we did, that would require us to raise interest rates more quickly, and that would probably be disruptive. So that argument is that, maybe it's time to begin raising rates and bringing the monetary policy closer to a more normal condition. So that's the debate. That's the argument that's going on today inside the Federal Reserve. Now, that being said, it seems pretty clear that the Fed has communicated that they will want to raise interest rates again at the next meeting in a couple of weeks in December, which will be a total of 2 increases since last year. And then looking forward into 2017, assuming the economy continues to expand, as we expect, the Fed would gradually and cautiously raise rates some more. But again, it's a good sign that the Fed is contemplating these increases because it means that the U.S. economy is stronger. It means that inflation is closer to target. And it means that, again, the Fed can look to bring monetary policy closer to a more normal condition. Now, as you know, we had an election here in the United States just a few weeks ago. And you might ask the question, well, if the economy is doing so well and unemployment is so low and wages are rising and so many positive things are happening, then why did the outsider, did Donald Trump, win the U.S. presidential election? And it's a great question. And I think there are a number of reasons why, despite the improvements in the U.S. economy, many people are still unhappy with the way the economy is going. First, of course, we did have a very severe financial crisis that required bailouts of some firms in New York and elsewhere. We had a deep recession, as I mentioned, with a lot of people losing their jobs. And there's a lot of anger still in the country about the crisis, the recession, and the response to that. So that is something that people have seen before in the 1930s in the Great Depression, which was also, of course, a financial crisis and a deep recession. We similarly had very strong political reactions, and we've seen that again more recently. So that's certainly a reason for the unhappiness. There are longer-term trends also going on in the United States, which have caused some people to be unhappy with the economy. One is inequality. This is a very long-term trend in the United States. For the last 35 or 40 years, very long time, there has been gradually an increase in the difference between the incomes at the very top of the income distribution and the people in the middle or in the lower portions of the distribution. And that spread between the highest and the lowest incomes has been rising. It's still continuing. And as a result, even though the economy overall has done much better, there are many people who, or at least families, who have not seen substantial increases in their living standards for quite a long time. Now, why is this happening? There are many forces at work. Certainly globalization, international trade and competition has affected some industries, and that certainly was one of the hot buttons, the sore spots that was attacked and discussed by candidate Trump. Likewise, technology has been changing, and those with more education and more skill have been better able to take advantage of the new technologies than those with less education, for example. And there are many other reasons as well. And so that increase in inequality, which again is continuing, has meant that many people are dissatisfied with their income and with their position in the economy. Related to that has been a very slow progress in productivity. There was a period after World War II up through the 1970s when productivity gains in the United States were very, very rapid, reflecting the application of new technologies that had been invented in the 1930s and 1940s, and the recovery from the war that led to a period of very rapid growth and very rapid gains in productivity and wages. In the last few years, productivity growth has been very slow, and that means practically that real wages, even for those in the upper half of the distribution, have not risen very quickly. So these two main factors, inequality and slow productivity growth, have meant that not everyone has shared in the overall prosperity of the U.S. economy and led many people to vote for someone who promised to make changes. On top of that, I think there are other factors, for example, concerns about changes in the immigration, people coming to the country, bringing different cultures, different languages. So there are, again, a number of factors that have led to the outcome that we've seen, and we will see how the politics evolves from here. But clearly, there was a lot of unhappiness that led to the result. Now, a good question is, where is this new administration going to take the United States? What's going to happen to our economy? What's going to happen to our international trade and foreign policy? I think the first answer is that nobody really knows. Mr. Trump talked about a lot of different things on the campaign trail. He was not always completely consistent. He didn't always specify all of the details of his plans. And we're still learning who will be in his cabinet, who will be the people who advise him. So I think it's, again, quite early to know exactly what kinds of policies we'll be seeing in the new administration. I think there are some areas of uncertainty and concern. Trade is certainly an area where, again, most economists would support trade, open trade, as being important for economic growth. But Mr. Trump has been concerned about the effect of trade on some industries and some workers, which is a legitimate concern. So we will see what kinds of changes get made in U.S. trade relationships. It seems likely that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which was negotiated with the United States and some other Asian countries, will not be ratified, at least certainly not in its present form. A particularly important set of issues will be how will the United States deal with China? How will China and the United States deal with their very important trading relationship? And I think, again, at this point, it's very uncertain. For example, candidate Trump said that he would tell his Treasury Secretary to identify China as, quote, a manipulator of currency, which is a legal status in the U.S. law. If a country is determined to be manipulating its currency, then there are certain sanctions that are automatically applied that would affect, for example, U.S. investment in China. But if you look at the law specifies what are the conditions that must be met for a country to be identified as a manipulator. And one of them is that the country needs to be acquiring a lot of reserves to keep the value of its exchange rate low. Now, that may or may not have been true in the past, but currently, of course, China is actually losing reserves, has been selling U.S. treasuries. So it doesn't seem to fit the technical definition of manipulation as defined in the U.S. law. So again, it's not clear exactly how this will evolve. I think we will see uncertainty and some market uncertainty about exactly, whether there will be any scaling back of U.S. trade relationships or whether there will be relatively small changes. That's hard to know at this point. Now, despite these uncertainties and concerns, particularly about trade, the U.S. markets have been pretty upbeat. The stock market has gone up noticeably since the election. Interest rates have gone up. The dollar has gone up. So why is this happening? I think the main reason is that the markets see a likely outcome of the Trump administration to be a fiscal expansion. That is a combination of tax cuts. President-elect Trump has talked about both personal tax cuts, income tax cuts, that is, and corporate tax cuts, together with spending on infrastructure like roads and bridges. Putting those things together would create a bigger budget deficit for the United States, and that in turn, could lead to a more growth, more inflation, and higher interest rates. That's something that the markets seem to be anticipating, and that seems to be the reason that interest rates, the dollar, and the stock market are all going up. Now, how big will this be? I think it's actually a good question. The Republican Party now controls the presidency and both houses of Congress, but they are not completely unified on economic issues. And in particular, some traditional Republicans are very concerned about the budget deficit. So while Trump and some of his supporters might want to have a bigger deficit in order to have more spending and have tax cuts, some Republicans in Congress might resist that. And so at this point, it's hard to know exactly how big the fiscal program will be and how much impact it will have on U.S. economy. So real questions there. Many other areas which I think it's not worth going into all the detail. The candidate Trump talked about repealing the health care law that was put in place by President Obama that increased health care coverage. How will he do that? Creates a lot of uncertainty for insurance companies and hospitals. Another area that he's talked about making big changes is in financial regulation. The Dodd-Frank Act was put in place in 2010 after the financial crisis to try to protect against the kinds of risks and threats that created that huge and terrible crisis. The Republican view is that at least some of the aspects of Dodd-Frank are too complicated or that they affect credit availability. There will be some changes probably made there. The Democratic Party will no doubt resist large changes, but that's an area where international banks will certainly be paying close attention. And finally, on U.S. policy, I think one area that is particularly important to me, and I think should be important to anyone interested in the markets, is what will happen with the Federal Reserve. There will be some changes, it appears. President-elect Trump has talked about replacing the chair, Janet Yellen, whose term lasts a bit more than a year from now. It's not clear who he would replace her with. Would he put somebody there who would be more inclined to raise interest rates, as most Republicans would probably be supportive of? Or will he, consistent with his previous experiences as a borrower, as a construction person, will he want somebody who will keep interest rates low? I think that's a very key question, and we'll be following that closely. Also, will there be changes in the law that affect the Federal Reserve? For example, Congress has talked about putting in a rule that would force the Fed to specify a rule by which it makes monetary policy. For various reasons, I think that's not a very good idea. In particular, I think that a simple rule is not going to be able to adequately capture the complexity of the U.S. economy and the responses that the Fed has to make. But that's an example of a kind of change that might come through and which presumably President Trump would sign. So there are a lot of uncertainties. The markets so far are happy with developments in the new administration, of course, which doesn't begin until January. But at this point, there's a lot that we don't know, a lot of uncertainty about where it's going to go. Now, let me turn and talk about a few other parts of the world. Let me talk first about Europe, another major advanced economy. The European recovery from the great financial crisis and recession has been a good bit slower than that of the United States for a number of reasons. They had, first of all, besides having the financial crisis and recession, they then had a sovereign debt crisis after that, with the debt of Greece and other countries being under threat. That was another negative. They have some longer-term issues in Europe, including slow population growth, slow productivity growth like the United States, and the fact that in this recovery, the single currency, the fact that 17 or 18 countries share a single currency, the euro, has not been as good a good arrangement for them, because some countries have needed very expansionary, aggressive monetary policy. Other countries, notably Germany, have not needed so much monetary support. And with a single currency, everybody has to have the same monetary policy, and so that has been an issue for the Eurozone. I think the point I would make, though, is that the reason that Europe has recovered so slowly, and it's worth stressing how much difference there is there. In the United States, the real output, the real gross domestic product, has exceeded by more than 10% the highest level before the crisis. In other words, we recovered everything we lost and added another 10% or so of real growth. In Europe, the growth is just now, the GDP has just now reached the pre-crisis level. So they're basically only now regaining what they lost from the crisis and the recession. So there's a very big difference in performance. And I think one of the key factors, besides, of course, the sovereign debt crisis, has been that monetary and fiscal policy were less aggressive in Europe and took much longer for them to take the necessary steps to help Europe recover. And in particular, Europe had a lot more austerity than the United States, tight budgets, budget cuts, and the European Central Bank, the Monetary Policy Authority, was not able to begin aggressive monetary ease until relatively recently. And before 2015, the legal and political opposition made it very difficult for the European Central Bank to undertake quantitative easing and similar policies. Those barriers were eventually eliminated, but only not until 2015. And for that reason, I think Europe is still somewhat behind where the U.S. and the United Kingdom are, for example. So they have some very serious challenges. I think that European Central Bank will have to continue to be very aggressive to keep monetary policy easy to help Europe continue to recover. They are making some progress, but again, they're starting pretty far behind the United States. Now, switching over through the Pacific and over to Asia, let me turn just to say a few words about Japan, of course, a major trading partner of China. Japan has a number of serious problems. They've had very slow population growth. In fact, their population is literally shrinking, which is clearly hard to have substantial economic growth if you also have a shrinking workforce as they have now. And they've also been struggling with deflation, falling prices for a number of years now. Now, they have become much more aggressive. In 2013, the program of Abenomics brought together both fiscal expansion and a very aggressive monetary policy by the Bank of Japan. And it was a program, I think, that has made some progress. Now, recently, the Bank of Japan has made taken a new approach. It's doing now what's called yield curve control, which means that it is now targeting not only the short-term overnight interest rate, the way the Fed does and other central banks, and the short-term overnight interest rate in Japan, as in Europe, is actually negative, but it's also targeting long-term interest rates like the 10-year rate on Japanese government bonds. So by doing that, they actually are, I think, getting somewhat better control of financial conditions, and overall it's been, I think, a positive development. But they still remain pretty far away from their goal of 2% inflation, and indeed they've now said they're going to overshoot 2% inflation. So I think that there's still some significant challenges there, and they may find themselves having to do more to get to their target. They've done a good thing by delaying their increase in consumption taxes. They're doing other fiscal steps to try to support their economy. But I think it is very important for them to address also the fundamental issues of their economy, which include structural reforms. There are many aspects of the Japanese economy which are very inefficient and could be improved. And at some point, they may want to talk more about what they can do about their workforce problem. Should they allow more immigration? Can they leave Japanese to have larger families? Some very tough questions. And again, without any steps in that direction, their labor force is going to continue to shrink, which will make it, again, very difficult for them to grow. Well, I have a few minutes left, and let me turn now. I think there will be certainly a lot of interest in this audience and on China, which, as I said before, U.S. and China are probably now the two key economies helping to set the tone for the global economy. To talk about China, let me talk for a minute about an American city called Pittsburgh. The city of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania was, for many years, one of America's largest steel-producing cities, and had many big steel factories there and heavy industry. There was a lot of smoke because of all the production in Pittsburgh. And then over time, the steel industry moved abroad to other countries, and many of the steel factories in Pittsburgh closed down or became unnecessary. So Pittsburgh restructured itself. It expanded on its strengths in finance, in education. For example, there's some very good universities in Pittsburgh. It increased its efforts in the cultural sphere, and in healthcare and a variety of areas. And today, Pittsburgh is a very wealthy city. There's no steel there, or not much, but it has remade itself into a city whose economy is supported by a whole range of modern services, from high technology to healthcare to education to finance. Now, Pittsburgh is only one city, but in a certain sense, that transformation that Pittsburgh made is what China as a country is trying to do. China grew from heavy industry, it grew from export manufacturing, it grew from infrastructure, it grew from a centrally planned perspective. But it is now at the point where growth along those dimensions is limited. There's a lot of excess capacity in heavy industry in China. The state-owned enterprises, at least some of them, are not very efficient or at least competitive with other companies around the world. And so China is in the process of trying to make a transformation analogous to the one that Pittsburgh made, whereby instead of smoky industries, it will have more high technology, more services, more consumer spending, more retail, more education, and to change the very structure of its economy. Now, this is a very challenging task. China has made progress. For example, services are a much bigger part of the economy than they used to be. But going forward, that is going to be the real challenge, I think, for China. And whether or not those reforms can be made and done in a way that promotes continued growth is the key question for China. I'm generally optimistic, but there are risks, and particularly China has to manage the large amount of credit that's been extended. It's going to have to manage some bubbles, and we see in some property areas. There are issues related to the currency, which I'm sure we can talk about in the discussion. But again, it's not so much an issue of providing enough demand the way Japan and Europe are trying to get inflation up to target. Rather, it's whether China can be successful in making this tremendous transformation that Pittsburgh made and now China has to make. I'll stop there, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bernanke. This is really a lot of information there. But before we are turning back to Beijing, I have a quick question for you. Do you think the proposed 3 to 4% growth President-elect Donald Trump has proposed can be achievable? And if, hypothetically, if that is achieved, does that the whole presumption of low productivity, inequality, the so-called new normal, that presumption could be overturned?
Well, there's some things that might help growth improve, and in particular, the productivity growth, which has been so very weak recently. I think it's reasonable to expect to be some improvement, and that growth should be a little bit better. Mm-hmm. That said, we've been consistently growing about 2% in the last few years, and getting to 3 or 4%. Certainly, beyond maybe 1 year, if there's a lot of fiscal spending, you could raise growth for a short time. Getting a sustained improvement in growth to 3 or 4% would be very, very difficult, and economists don't have a lot of good advice, because essentially what you need there is big improvements in productivity, new technologies. Those are things that happen at a decentralized level. They happen in companies, they happen in laboratories. It's hard for the government or for economists to sort of magically create that productivity. So that's what's going to be the source of more rapid growth, is improved productivity.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned just now that China, actually the reserve, the foreign exchange reserve is draining out. The capital is flying out, mm-hmm. and renminbi is depreciating. The PBOC is doing something to slow down that process. But should there something need to be done, or this could be done differently for a country like China?
No, I think China's managing their currency reasonably well at this point. There was some miscommunication around the devaluation in August 2015 that led to some market confusion, mm-hmm. but early this year, China began to explain more clearly what the plan was, sort of a managed float for the renminbi. I think there's other things that can be done. I mean, including, for example, relying more on fiscal policy rather than monetary policy, because monetary ease will tend to lower interest rates, will tend to push money out of the country. I do think first two comments. One is that the fundamental confidence in China's reforms underlie the strength of the RMB. So if people lose confidence in the reforms and therefore in sustainability of Chinese growth, that will have a bad effect on RMB. But if reforms continue and it looks like growth will continue in China, then that will keep money in the country. The other comment is that it's going to, China will probably be stepping back a little bit from the desire to have a global reserve currency. The papers here were reporting some steps to slow down capital outflows, for example. But I think that's not so important for China. I think it's more important for China is to achieve the reforms and to worry about the international role of the renminbi at a later time.
I think joining the IMF SDR is helpful?
It was a symbol. It was a symbol. It meant that China had achieved certain certain standards, but it doesn't actually have much effect on the Chinese economy. In the same way, I know people don't generally believe it, but I think the fact that the dollar is such an important reserve currency has only modest benefits to the U.S. economy itself. So it is a symbol, but it is not necessarily a major benefit in itself that the renminbi became part of the SDR.
One last from me. Let's go back to the financial crisis. I think in your latest memoir, The Courage to Act, you gave a detailed account of what you did through the financial crisis, including helping bailing out the financial institutions, and why those things had to be done in those ways.
Yes.
So looking back right now, today, do you think there is something that it could be done differently with a different result?
Well, I think that so first, we didn't really see it coming. We didn't fully anticipate by any means the severity of the crisis, and I wish, of course, that we had understood better that the decline in house prices and the problems that would cause would in turn lead to what was essentially a bank run. There was a huge run on the financial system, and we didn't see that coming, and I wish we had obviously had prepared for that better. Once we understood that what was happening was essentially a big run on the financial system, I think we responded, given the tools we had, pretty effectively. The one additional thing I would say, though, is, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my remarks, the anger of the public at the bailouts and at the crisis is still a factor. It was probably a factor in the politics. I wish we had somehow or another, communicated better, explained better as you said, that what we did because it was essential to preserving the stability of the U.S. economy. I don't think everyone understands that, and I don't know if we could have explained it better, but we tried. But that would be certainly something I wish that we had been more successful at.
All right, thank you so much. With that, we are going back to Huangshan, Beijing.